Captain, we have them. We've established Transporter Lock, the Star Trek podcast. Join Ken and Sabriel each week as they explore strange new episodes, seek out new plots and new characters, and boldly go where no podcast has gone before.
Hello and welcome to Transporter Lock. I'm your Chief Engineer, Ken Gagne.
And I'm your First Officer, Tiffany Bridge.
Hello, Tiffany. We are back within less than a week from our last episode to discuss more Star Trek Prodigy.
Well, you know, it's that good. We got to keep watching.
Watching or waffling?
Waffling. Sorry, we're recording early today, and I'm not quite on my game yet.
It is early on a Saturday morning, and since Prodigy launched all 20 episodes simultaneously on July 1st, we are trying to keep up. My former co-host Sabriel recently texted me and said, "Hey, I'm on episode 13. What about you?" And I'm like, "I finished episode 2." And of course, there are people out there who have watched all 20 episodes in the first day. We are not able to keep that pace, but we are trying to get these episodes out so that people can listen as they watch the show.
Absolutely. Or, you know, listen after the fact and then marvel at what we don't know yet. Whatever floats your boat.
There is so much we don't know. First Officer Bridge. So much.
There's so much. And it really comes out, I think, in these 2 episodes.
How much we don't know?
How much we don't know.
Not you and me specifically, just the audience.
The audience. Right?
Okay.
Yeah, you and me specifically don't know. No, the audience does not know.
Okay. Because I really don't want to advertise this podcast to my friends and say, like, hey, here's a podcast about how ignorant my friends and I are.
I mean, I suppose that's a genre.
I could do that podcast, but I don't want to. But I have heard from people who have watched all 20 episodes that this is one of the finest seasons of Trek ever.
Yeah, I've heard that too, and I am really excited to kind of continue through this season. I have to say, on these couple of episodes, I was thinking, you know, is this how is this going to work out? Because it was, but every time it started to feel like predictable. That was almost like a sign from the writers that no, like where you think we're going to zig, we're going to zag, and I really enjoyed that about these couple.
Yeah, when I first started the season, I thought, okay, so the arc this season is to save Chakotay. That's an episode. And
right.
And by the end of the 3rd episode, or near the end of the 3rd episode, I was like, okay, we've done it. Now what? And then I was like, oh, okay. Yep.
Yes, like well, they've saved Chakotay, but they still don't know where he's ended up, right? By the end of the 4th episode.
They saved him not in the way they were meant to.
Right.
Yeah. So we're reviewing this week Who Saves the Saviors and Temporal Mechanics 101. Where do you want to go from here? Where would you like to start?
Well, you know, I think as always, I really want to take just a moment to talk about all of these sort of small shout outs and tie-ins that we get here, because It was not until this week that I learned the name of the Vulcan who's the head of Nova Squadron. Her name is Majel, which is clearly a reference to Module Barrett Roddenberry, whose name nearly escaped me there for a second, of which, you know, my great apologies. She's obviously iconic. So I enjoyed that they named the Vulcan after her. And then, of course, you know, they arrive on the planet where Chakotay is marooned. And what's the first thing she does? She puts a headband around her head to hide her ears.
Just like Spock in Star Trek.
Just
4.
like Spock in another Star Trek time travel plot we may be familiar with, the one with the whales. So I you know, watching her do that, and it was the same kind of shape headband that Spock wore that I really enjoyed it. It was clearly a very intentional homage, and I enjoyed it a lot. So I always like to shout those things out. But you know, they show up on the planet and they immediately find Chakotay and his bird first officer, I guess.
Yes.
And something that I appreciate about this is the way that Jankom cannot stop making bird jokes the entire episode. Like he cannot stop himself.
He's not even trying. It just happens.
Like it just comes out. Um, and they show up and they like immediately find out what Chakotay's plan is, but he leads it with like, "Can you kids keep a secret?" And no, they absolutely cannot keep a secret, which is how they're in this situation to begin with.
Yes, that is not one of the skills that they have developed as young people.
They do not have a lot of OPSEC. That's for sure.
A lot of what?
OPSEC, operational security.
Yes, I agree.
So I enjoyed that. And well, it's funny because right after they explain that, after Chakotay explains the plan and they help Chakotay get out of the enclosure, Zero immediately says, "Well, we must always have been here to help." And I had just at that moment been thinking, "Oh, is this going to turn out that they had always been there to help?" Because that's extremely predictable. And then as soon as Zero said it out loud, I was like, oh, that's a sign that this is not how that's going to go, is it?
Well, that kind of confused me because if they were preordained to rescue Chakotay, to help him get out of the cell, then when did things go awry? Because in the video playback from the Protostar, we saw Chakotay being left on the planet and apprehended as the Protostar launched into the wormhole. That video footage is no longer capable of being recorded. When we saw the video, there was some interference, there were some parts where the video cut out, but you can't deny the fact that he was on the planet when the Protostar launched. So if the kids were supposed to be there to get him out of the cell, how come Chakotay ended up on the ship anyway? Like, how are things supposed to work?
Well, I think that's kind of the point of this, right? Is that Zero, who has not seen that footage, if I recall correctly. Has Zero seen that footage?
I think all 5 of the kids were in the briefing room with Janeway.
I thought Zero was distracting somebody else at that time, but maybe I'm wrong. But so Zero thinks that that everything's gonna go to plan, and I think that is, to me, that's like the lampshade that things are absolutely not going to go to plan. It's kind of like when a character says, "Oh, well, we'll talk when I get back from this extremely dangerous mission." That's your sign they're not coming back from this extremely dangerous mission. So I felt like when Zero says, "Oh, well, we were clearly here all along to help him," that's the sign it's not going to go right, and then we see it not go right. Right? We see exactly what the point of divergence was, because while the kids are distracting Chakotay's captors, they lose track of a disruptor, and now Chakotay has a weapon that he didn't have the first time around. And of course, being an experienced officer, he's going to take every advantage he can get, and he manages to get himself and his Eagle first officer, Adric, onto the Protostar and launch it. It was nice to see the Protostar again. And but of course, this clearly throws the whole timeline into disarray.
It does. And I'm trying to figure out how are they going to fix this. The only way I can think of is similar to the TV show The Flash. There were multiple times, especially in the first 2 or 3 seasons, where he would go back in time to change history, and then he would go back in time to stop the version of himself that just went back in time to change history.
Right.
So I could imagine like another set of Dal and Jankom and Zero showing up on the planet to stop themselves from rescuing Chakotay so that Chakotay can be rescued.
Right. I could certainly imagine that kind of thing happening. And I know like they make a reference to like how often like causal time loops have happened in Starfleet's history, and they specifically call out the Bell riots and the Cochrane warp test. And here I was thinking that the Bell riots had gotten classified, but apparently everyone knows that Sisko went and caused the Bell riots to happen.
Well, even in the DS9 episode, Little Green Men, when the Ferengi are on their way to Earth, I think it was Nog who was looking through the history books and said, "Hey, look, this guy, Bell, looks just like Captain Sisko."
Yeah.
So, and by the way, the Bell riots are this year. It's October of 2024.
Well, and I'm looking around thinking, yeah, I think that's probably about right.
Oh gosh, a month before the elections, you're probably not far off.
Yeah. But. So, but meanwhile, while that's happening, we get back to Solum, right? And we see Gwyn getting ready to do her Valura ritual, which apparently involves like a fight to the death in a pit.
Yeah, super mysterious, right? That's all it
Yeah.
is. I
Yeah,
thought
and
they were
it's just
going to descend into an ancient labyrinth and have to solve puzzles and prove their worth and have their a feather weighed against a heart or something. And no, it's just fight each other.
fight each other in a pit. Though we did learn a little bit about where the heirloom comes from, because that was one of those sort of cultural things that never really gets explained from the first season, right? We know that Gwyn has this interesting weapon slash tool that is fluid and shape changing and responds to her telepathically. And they never really explained that because we never met anybody else from Solom. It was just her and the diviner. And so to have to get into this pit without their heirlooms, she and Essentia, and then they have to kind of make the ambient dust, some sort of element in the environment, respond to them as their heirlooms. That was kind of interesting, and I enjoyed that, and I like and Gwyn nearly makes it out of the pit, right? She's using Essensia's efforts essentially against her, and nearly makes it out of the pit when the timeline goes haywire.
Yeah, these heirlooms are apparently bonded to individuals, and before they are bonded, they can be controlled by anybody, which really created a Jedi-like battle. I was reminded of Kylo Ren and Rey trying to pull a saber, and they're
Mhm.
using the Force. One's pointing at one direction, one's pointing at the other. And it was very similar here, where Essentia is sending these unbonded heirlooms at Gwyn, and Gwyn is just taking that energy and using it and redirecting it.
Yeah,
And she would have gotten out first, and it was kind of disappointing to know that whoever gets out of the pit first wins. Like, I was kind of hoping that there was going to be a twist, like Essentia would escape the pit and the elders would say, "You are a coward who has, run away from the pit. You lose the test. The
right.
test is to see who can stay in there the longest." But instead it was like, no, we're going to lower this pit and then you come back up, down.
Yeah.
Oh, it's a yo-yo. Congratulations, you won the yo-yo contest.
Well, I can imagine that the goal of the ritual is to see who does a better job, like whose will is stronger on the this like element that creates the heirlooms, right? Who's better at wielding that when they don't have the advantage of something that's bonded to them specifically. And I thought that was why I thought that Gwyn's solution was so clever, right? Is like, I will let you send all of these like needle sharp blades into the wall, and then I will climb them. But then, of course, we know what happens. She goes all back to the future and starts sort of fading out of existence. And I really did like that was the first thing I thought of is like as the timeline starts changing, suddenly Gwyn starts like fading in and out of existence and isn't able to like isn't strong enough to continue her climb and eventually falls down. And I was thinking of that scene with Michael J. Fox and the guitar at the
Hmm.
Enchantment Under the Sea dance, where suddenly he can't hold the guitar anymore.
It was exactly that. And it was a little confusing to me because they said the only person whose existence depends on this timeline is Gwyn, which in a way is true. But the presence of all the other characters somewhere other than Tars Lamora is also dependent on the previous timeline because they used the Protostar to escape that planet. And I know Janeway said, "Oh, maybe the Infinity's shielding is protecting our entire timeline," but that still seemed a little sketchy to me.
It is, but they're still with the Infinity at this point. So
But Janeway is not,
that's
and neither
true.
is Rock nor Murph.
Yeah, I mean, there's always some hand waviness in these kinds of time loop plots, right? Where the timeline doesn't solidify right away. And I think it probably makes sense that the person whose existence was dependent on the timeline would be most immediately affected. I think, but I think there's definitely some hand waviness here that I just sort of like I accepted in other shows. Like I watch Doctor Who. Nothing on Doctor Who ever makes any kind of sense. Why, I can only expect so much from a time travel plot. Um, so I
No,
think good.
Yeah, time travel it's very open to interpretation. I mean, if you look at Avengers Endgame, they specifically cite all these time travel movies and then say time travel doesn't work like that. Those are just movies, which Avengers Endgame clearly is not. So and then we also get into all the time travel that they engage in at the end, where they turn the Infinity into a time ship.
Mhm.
What did you think of
Right.
that?
I enjoyed that for a couple of reasons. First of all, of course, Jankum knows how to turn it into a time ship. Of course, he does. Um, but what I appreciated about that scene, because I'm always in every show for like the character development, right? That's always my favorite part of it. We've seen Jankum like emphasize how polite he's being multiple times during this episode, and here he goes in this huge rant about um was it in this episode or the next one where he has followed all the manuals and he's done everything by the book and it's still not working. And then he gets mad and he punches it and suddenly it works, right? And it's been so it's this has been like Jankum's journey with Starfleet is, because they all came back and they all know that they've got to like shape up and fit into Starfleet. And they've all been struggling with it in their own ways, right? Rock is like a very much a rule follower and kind of struggles with wanting to follow all the rules versus help her friends. And we've seen how Dal is struggling with it, of course. And now this has really been like Jankum's thing. Like he's been trying to comb his hair very neatly, and he's been trying to be very polite, and he's been trying to like actually fix things instead of engaging in percussive maintenance. But it doesn't work until it just sort of lets loose and does things his way.
Yeah,
And I enjoyed that.
it's funny because in the first season of Voyager, Chakotay encounters a former Maquis, now a Starfleet member, who has like fixed a panel or something. And Chakotay says, like, did you fill out a form? Did you report this to engineering? Blah, blah, blah. And the guy's like, no, I just fixed it. That's the way we do it on the Maquis. We don't go through all this bureaucracy of Starfleet. And Chakotay punches him in the face. Chakotay says, well, that's also how we do things in the Maquis. We're not Maquis anymore. We're Starfleet.
Right.
And so we saw Chakotay and his crew struggle with, but successfully make that transition and be better for it. And here we see Jankum trying to make that same transition. We're like, no, Jankum, just be true to yourself. And that's the way forward.
Well, I mean, so this is a show for children. So of course the messaging is going to be a little bit different. Um, so we're of course going to be talking about like embracing the thing that makes you unique and not trying to be something you're not. And I think that's the right message here for children, even though as you and I as adults understand that when you are in a workplace, a professional workplace, certain compromises must be made. And you have to do that in order to get along with people who are unlike yourself. But I think there's also something very like true to Trek there in the sense that the show has always been about infinite diversity and infinite combination. And part of what makes Starfleet what it is, part of what makes the Federation what it is everybody bringing their uniqueness to it. And so why shouldn't Jankum fix things the way Jankum knows how to fix things?
That's right. There are compromises to be made, but if conformity were the ultimate goal, then there would be no distinction between Starfleet and the Borg.
Right. Right. And so like holding those differences and celebrating them while still maintaining enough like core discipline so that it's still because it's still a military, right? It's a military. There's a chain of command. There are uniform requirements and things like that. So watching Jankum sort of come to terms with and start to come to terms with what that means for him personally is interesting. And it's something that I noticed as we kind of move into the next episode, Temporal Mechanics 101, is when they start that episode and everybody's kind of explaining themselves to Janeway. Did you notice how neatly Jankum's hair was combed?
I mean, in general,
I
yes.
noticed. Yeah, but like specifically in that episode, like I wrote like in that moment, I noticed like how he had very much like presented himself in a particular way for his debrief with the Admiral. So, um, but as we as we move into that episode, because I think we've established everything about the third one. Something that I sort of glommed onto as more of that hand wavy stuff was when they were talking about how the timeline's been altered in a way I've never seen. I don't know, bro. Have you seen a lot of timelines being altered? Is that like a regular thing for you? Uh,
And even if the timeline were altered, would you be aware of it? So, like, from your perspective, the timeline is never altered. It's just the one you're in.
well, and he was, it was the first officer, and he was um monitoring it on instruments, right? And so he was looking for, I don't know, chronotons and tachyons or whatever. And so like I can see that like you would notice something is changing if you're specifically looking for it and if you specifically have the instrumentation to measure it. But it's like, well, it's been altered in a way I've never seen. Like, is that like any timeline alteration is what you've never seen, my dude?
Right. And there was yet another callback to Worf shifting between quantum realities.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. So we're not necessarily conflating, but we're drawing on the history of both time travel and quantum realities because they say Gwyn is sort of shifting between one timeline and the other. And of course, they have their version of a mobile emitter that allows her to be
Right.
stabilized.
Sounds
But
like, of course, the doctor got her something that she could wear on her arm
yeah,
to keep her stable.
but I was a little confused, which seems to be a recurring theme for me as I watch this season. When, like, as you and I said, Gwyn is the only one whose existence depends on that timeline. So why does saving her become a priority, not just for the Infinity, but also for Voyager? Like, why? I mean, the whole timeline is at risk, and they're worried about this one teenage girl.
I thought that was interesting, and I assumed it was because they well, and this is the part that I'm finding confusing, and maybe I need to go back to the first episode again and rewatch. But if Gwyn's whole mission is to prevent the Civil War on Solum, if she successfully prevents the Civil War on Solum, doesn't that negate her personal timeline? Like, doesn't the diviner never have to go looking for the Protostar in the first place?
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's something that you and I were talking about in the last podcast too, where they're trying to preserve the timeline on the other side of the wormhole while change the timeline on this side of the wormhole. And they're trying to have it both ways.
Right. Right. Um, so it's very because if now I'm like pausing in the middle of a recording because I'm trying to figure out how to make this work. And maybe I should just accept that this is how the plot is working right now. This is the thing about time travel plots is that they're very difficult if you're trying to like make them make internal sense.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it works well and other times it doesn't, but it's very difficult to pull that off, I think. But also, we're only like 4 episodes in, so maybe more of this will be explained. Maybe it'll make more sense as we go.
Well, this brings up a question I had for you, which is you were talking about the lessons these episodes have for kids about being yourself. But also, you and I are two adults well versed in science fiction who are having trouble understanding the temporal mechanics of these episodes. How are kids going to handle this?
I think that, I mean, if we're talking about my kid, he's not going to think about it that in that level of detail. Like he is not parsing this out, right? Kids his age, they're here for the vibes, right? They're here for the kids having cool adventures and the fight on the planet and the cool like the cool effects when the ship hits warp. Like they're here for vibes. I don't think children are really like digging into that level. They'll just sort of accept it and roll with it. And so it is possible that we're just expecting a level of internal consistency that we don't have a right to expect.
You know, there was a time travel movie made on TV when I was a kid. I think it actually had Bill Maher as the main character, if I'm recalling
Really?
correctly. Well, I might be wrong, but I'm sure this is here. Let me look up his filmography. Yeah, it was called Out of Time. It came out in 1988. I was 100% correct. It's got Bill Maher. And I remember at the end, spoiler, but if you haven't seen it by now, he has like a phone booth, kind of like Bill and Ted. That's a time machine, and it only has enough juice for like so many jumps. So
Mhm.
at one point, like he goes back to 1988, and he like hangs out with his great grandfather or something. And at the end of the episode, like he jumps back one day to when he arrived in 1988, and he redoes what he did when he originally arrived, but differently. And I remember I was 9 years old. I was watching this with my parents and my three older brothers, and I'm like, but if he goes back a day, then there should be another time machine there, and he won't have used up his last jump. There will be another time machine with one more jump left in it, and he can just use that one to get home. And my brothers got mad at me. They're like, "Shut up, Ken," because they were doing what you say kids do, which is they just wanted to sit back and watch the movie. I mean, my brother, I remember distinctly remember the brother who said this to me was 21 years old, and I'm 9 years old. And I'm unraveling the temporal paradox here. And he's like, shut up. I just want to watch a movie. And I was like, and so it's no wonder that I grew up to watch Star Trek and he didn't.
This is like portrait of Ken as a young child. Nothing about the story you just told is at all surprising to me.
It's also a story of Ken as an adult because my interactions with media and family have not changed significantly.
I mean, it's also possible that they're actually going to explain all this really well and wrap it up in a neat little bow, right? Because we're still getting like the mysterious message, save Gwen, and and Gwen gets her own like visions and her own mysterious messages in this episode about togetherness and how she's kind of existing at 2 points in the timeline at once, which is interesting. Um, but I noticed like at the beginning of this episode, Rock gets summoned to the bridge, and Janeway's super mad, but then we never figure out what they summon Rock for. Like, because they're digging into like what's happening with the timeline, and they don't really talk to Rock until she pipes up with like the ultimate gifted kid triumph moment where she solves the problem that the more experienced officers can't.
And the wording she used was, we could boost the signal to compensate for the gravitational waves or whatever. I was like, really? You don't think anybody on the bridge considered boosting the signal? Like,
Look, let Rock have her moment, okay?
like, oh, let's just do the thing we're already doing, except harder.
We'll just do more.
Right, right. But yeah, these temporal messages save Gwyn. You have to be together. In some weird delivery, Dahl did voice to text to ask, "Is this coming from Voyager?" And the mysterious person took the time to say, "No, haha. I'm not going to tell you who it's from, but I'm going to tell you who it's not from."
Right, exactly. Like, why isn't the mysterious messenger identifying themselves? Probably for protecting the timeline reasons.
And this mysterious voice also fixes the ship so that it can fly, but only after it's become a time ship, which I assume was a one-trick pony. And as you said, Gwyn had the message that you all have to stay together. And then Murph is talking to somebody mysterious on the Voyager ship at the end of the episode.
My notes here are just all caps and says, "What does Murph know?"
Well, who is Murph talking to? I have two theories. Do you have any?
Um, yeah, I mean, so here's the thing. If everybody else is getting mysterious messages, why shouldn't Murph, right? Murph is probably getting some kind of mysterious message. And of course, the problem is that like Murph's language is not accessible to the universal translator. So we don't know how we're going to figure that out. Um, but it was just, all this time, like we've kind of been treating Murph as like fun comic relief. And so it's always fun when Murph actually gets like plot relevant action. So I'm just hoping for like more Murph in future episodes. Like give Murph something to do other than be adorable and hilarious.
Isn't that enough, though?
I mean, it is enough, but um they keep making these like something about this show is that they make these like one-off jokes and then they turn out to be like actual plot relevant elements. So I'm excited to see more Murph coming up.
But do you have theories about who he's talking to? And I know you've already seen episode 5, which we're not discussing here today, so no spoilers.
Right. So my theory was like I was concerned when I saw that and was like, is Murph like working against them in some way?
Mm,
Right? Is this a, never trust the adorable and hilarious comic relief? I got worried about that for a second.
as well, you should.
But also, I mean, the other theory is like, okay, Murph's getting his own version of these messages, right? Gwen's having visions, Dal's getting messages to the infinity. Janeway gets like an orb that appears in front of her and speaks through the cosmos into Voyager's comm system. Why shouldn't Murph get his own version? Maybe he's talking to the same person the rest of them are.
Except it seems to be more of a two-way communication than most of the other crewmen are experiencing.
Yeah, I mean, I felt like we only got like a real quick flash of what Murph was doing. So, because I think Gwen got to ask questions, didn't she?
I don't think
In
so. She was like knocked unconscious and she was
she
told to
was
stay
having she had
together.
a vision.
Right.
Did she not get to? Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm imagining that.
Well, she thought the vision was her father at first.
Mm,
Hmm. I think the vision said, it's not your time. You have to stay together. That's pretty much it.
yeah, I should have transcribed. My notes are a little patchy on this episode. Though I did write down, "I'm a doctor, not an exorcist." So,
And in the very first episode, I think he said, like, I'm a doctor, not a porter, because they
mhm.
told him to. Do you know the story about Robert Picardo's audition for Voyager?
I don't. Why don't you tell me?
So you may recall in the very first season of Voyager, the character of the Doctor had no autonomy or agency about when he was turned on and off.
Right.
And so he was reading a scene from one of the early episodes, and the episode ends with the other crewman leaving the room and forgetting to turn off the Doctor. So he's just left on. And so the scene ends with the Doctor saying, "Hello, excuse me, you forgot me, I'm still here." And so he reads that line, and then Robert Picardo ad libs, "I'm a doctor, not a nightlight." And he got the part.
Yeah, I think every Trek show has had to have at least one, like what the doctor is not reference in it, right? Like I feel like this is one of the most common recurring Star Trek gags, and I love it.
Even in the very season series finale of Discovery, Dr. Colber did it.
Yeah.
There was a moment where Book said, like, how do you know the frequency of the portal? And I think he said something like, I know, right? I'm a doctor, not a physicist. But
Best recurring joke. It's important for every Trek to have a doctor who uses that construction.
essential. So we were talking about Gwyn, and I want to mention that I really am enjoying her relationship with her father. I think it's very natural and sweet, and it shows a different side of the character and potentially creates a timeline where he doesn't grow up to be a jerk. Because in the original timeline, he becomes a despot and then a father. Like
Right.
he constantly refers to Gwendala as offspring, not even naming her because
Right.
she was created for a purpose. And now in this timeline, he's a father first and potentially a despot later. And
Right.
one would hope, although not necessarily, because there are despots out there who are fathers, that he is a little bit softer now that he has seen his daughter, gotten to know her, and understand that the person he is today is not the person she knew, and he doesn't want to be that person.
And it's really sweet to watch her kind of try to protect him from that knowledge, right?
Yeah.
Like she doesn't want to tell him that he was kind of a crap father, that he was harsh and mean, and like she really only tells him the good stuff. Like you taught me the language of 1,000 species, and she really kind of gives him the better version of himself. And something that somebody pointed out a couple of years ago, and I don't remember somebody on Twitter, but it was something about how so much of media that's sort of made by millennials. Now the millennials are becoming like screenwriters and the showrunners and things like that. Is so much media has become about like getting apologies from your parents. Um, And what does that say about sort of the millennial psychology? And I feel like it's not the same thing because this version of the diviner doesn't have anything to apologize for yet. But this idea of sort of healing her relationship with him by finding a different version of him who actually is, warm and caring and is excited to be a father for its own sake, is really beautiful. It's really beautiful that she finally gets the father that she deserved to have, even though she doesn't get to stay with him for very long.
Yeah, and that's still to be determined how much this character will play a role because he's still on the planet of Solum, as is Essentia, and he is like the royal observer. Was that his title? I think.
Yeah, like the royal astronomer,
Yeah.
something like that.
And his voice carried weight. When he walked in with this outsider, they allowed her to speak because he was accompanied by her. By him, I mean. And so with him and Essentia still on the planet, I'm sure that those two will be interacting in future episodes.
Yeah, it's so interesting because, of course, her father is voiced by John Noble, who played Denethor in the Lord of the Rings movies. And whenever somebody famous pops up in a role, I always imagine like the casting discussion, right? Because I remember thinking that like, oh, of course they got John Noble for this in the first season because like, of course, if you're thinking about like a terrible father who's concerned more about whatever who's concerned more about the war in the country and kind of treats their offspring as like a pawn in it. Like you're thinking like Denethor. Like we really want like a John Noble type for this. Well, what's John Noble doing? Maybe we could just get him. And so of course that's who he was in the first season. And so in this season, of course, he's a wonderful actor and really also gives us that like softness and kindness that we didn't see in the first season. So that's been fun. And I hope we get more of him. Like there's a lot of Trek left this season. I hope we get more of him.
Yeah, if this is the version of the character they were casting for, they might not have gone for Denethor, but that's why he's an actor. He contains multitudes,
It contains
and we get
multitudes.
we get to see the soft side.
Yeah.
Something else that we are seeing this season, which I thought was gone after the first season, is the Protostar. We saw it launch into the wormhole, and we also see it at the beginning of every single episode in the opening sequence.
Yes.
Discovery would change their credits every season. Prodigy has not. The Protostar is still prominent in the beginning of every episode. And so I think that perhaps speaks to the role Protostar will play or the fact of its existence by the end of the season.
Yeah, I was thinking that too as I was watching the credits, is that, by showing us the Protostar in the credits, it really does seem to be an assertion that the Protostar is still central, even though nobody starts out on the Protostar this season. And even though we really only see the Protostar fly for a few seconds in this episode, like the Protostar itself must still be really, is this still the story of the crew of the Protostar? And are they still the crew of the Protostar in any meaningful sense? So I'm interested to see where we go with that as well.
Especially since the Protostar has a hologram Janeway, who we saw sacrifice herself at the end of the first season. Are they going to
Right.
undo that sacrifice? Is there going to be a freshly rebooted Janeway on that ship?
Right. I was thinking about that as well because they get onto the Protostar. And of course, like that Janeway doesn't appear because they don't need the training holo. They know what to do. They're experienced officers. But we have picked up the Protostar early enough in its timeline that it still has the Janeway on it. But it's not the Janeway that has been impacted by her repeated interactions with the kids. So yeah, so we've still got potentially like a fresh copy of Janeway, of Training Janeway. And but then we've also still got the actual Protostar, their version of the Protostar still hanging around at Starfleet somewhere, yeah? I don't
Yeah,
know. I
didn't
guess it
we?
was
I think at the end of season one, we saw another Protostar under development.
right.
Yeah, I don't know. It's going to be weird to like if a fresh Janeway hologram shows up, it'll be kind of like Gamora in Guardians of the Galaxy, where we have the character back, but not the version we know. And I'm like, do we need a hologram Janeway now that we have Flesh and Blood Janeway?
Well, I think, are we going to have Flesh and Blood Janeway if there's a season 3, right? Like, are they going to get sent off somewhere? Because look, again, I know I love to invoke the Kelvin timeline, but if Kirk can become captain of the flagship right out of the academy in the Kelvin timeline, anything can happen with these kids in the Protostar and the training Janeway.
That's something that I was thinking of, is that there have been Star Trek conventions and Star Trek games that build themselves as the first time all 5 captains have been together. And at the time, that was Kirk, Picard, Sisko, Janeway, and Archer. There have been many more captains since then, but if you were to try to have an all-captain convention nowadays, it would have to include Dal.
Right? Right? Dal is the captain.
That's weird.
And so we're going to see him get to really be a captain and not just kind of a stowaway who steals a ship.
Yeah, when I think of great captains in Star Trek history, I think of the 5 I just mentioned, and I don't think this little purple kid with a rat's tail. But
maybe this is about us expanding our mind, friend.
I know. It's narrow-minded of me. I apologize. I'm not racist against purple people, I swear. So, all right. So I had asked you if you had any theories about who Murph was talking to, because I said I have 2 theories of my own, and I would like to share those theories with you now, Tiffany.
Yes, please do.
Since we were just talking about Captain Archer, is there the possibility that Murph is talking to Future Guy?
I don't know.
Do you remember Future
Guy?
That he was never canonically called that.
You mean Kovich?
No, in seasons 1 through 3 of Enterprise, especially at season 1, the Suliban, the alien race, so that were all kind of stretchy like Mr. Fantastic because of genetic testing and engineering, they were seen speaking to an outline of somebody from the future. And that person was saying, oh, the humans are going to destroy you. You need to destroy them first. And it was this Cold War temporal manipulation. And we never found out the identity of this person. And so fans just referred to him as Future Guy.
Oh, thank you for reminding me of that. I had forgotten. That's an interesting theory. Huh. I'll have to think on that. I did not remember that enough to have made a theory about it, but now I'm going to be thinking about it.
Because there was a novel I read that focused on the Department of Temporal Investigations, with Skulder and Mully or whatever. And that book revealed the identity of that character. But books are not canon. And Star Trek loves to pull at threads and reveal, and resolve cliffhangers, like the epilogue of Discovery's series finale, for example. So maybe 20 years later, we're going to find out who Future Guy is. But speaking of pulling at threads, Lower Decks Season 5 is the 5th and final season. It is airing later this year, and there is a campaign to save Lower Decks. And I saw a cute image macro going around about it took scenes from the season 2 finale of Picard, and it showed Wesley Crusher, and he said how the universe is a beautiful tapestry, but it's only ever one thread pull away from annihilation. And in this macro, Corey says, so why are you here? And Will Wheaton says, because they canceled Lower Decks, implying that he's there to fix it. And I was like, wait a minute. He was talking in that pitch, that recruitment pitch to Corey, about how time is so fragile and knowing when to step in and nudge things along is the job of the travelers, of him and his colleagues. Mm-hmm. Could this Future Guy in Prodigy be a traveler? Could it be Will Wheaton?
I mean, I would love to see a Will Wheaton cameo in Prodigy. I feel like that Will Wheaton should cameo in all the things.
Right.
right? I feel like Star Trek has been enough of a source of like consternation in his life that they should continue to put him in things. Um, but yeah, I don't know. That's interesting. I still kind of like your future guy theory. I'm going to be thinking about that a lot. Um, but I don't know. Yeah, I mean, it always did seem weird to me that we don't see the travelers more often. And I realize that's because like then it becomes like after a while it becomes a little bit too tempting to be like a Deus Ex Machina sort of situation. But we already have a situation where like some mysterious benefactor is like fixing the ship invisibly and we don't know why. Like that was so super weird that like sure, why couldn't it be a traveler that just sort of makes the ship work at the right moment?
Of course, if we are seeing travelers more often, then they are not very good at their jobs because they shouldn't be seen.
There's that. That's true. That's
Although if
true.
if this is a traveler, his manipulations in this timeline are pretty heavy-handed. Giant
Yeah.
orb appearing outside the Voyager.
Yeah. It doesn't feel like the traveler's style.
Yeah, he could have just like poked at the circuits of the Voyager and made it not able to do whatever it was not supposed to do. And instead he
Right.
decided to coalesce as a bubble and say, Janeway, not now. That was my bubble voice.
Yeah, this traveler very unsubtle.
Yeah.
All
Well,
the other travelers are like, "Oh, come on, man, really?"
we taught you better than that. So there were two other call outs I want to mention before we start wrapping up, but were there any major plot points that you wanted to catch?
No, I think these episodes are really still we're still kind of doing setup, right? Like
Yeah.
we're kind of moving all the pieces into place, and I think in these next few episodes we're really going to start to see things like start to coalesce.
Yeah. One thing I want to point out, and this is actually a note from our former co-host, Captain Sabriel, which was the Voyager ship, whatever it's the A or the 2 or whatever, it's a Lamar class ship.
Yes.
Do you know what that means? Like who Lamar
I
is?
I don't know who Lamar is. Do you know who? Does Sabriel know who Lamar
Sabriel
is?
does. I did not. I thought the only thing I could think of, which I assumed was wrong, since there was a Doctor Who reference in a previous episode, I thought this might be a reference to
Mhm.
John Lamar, who's the chief engineer of the Orville.
Oh,
It is not him. It is a reference to Hedy Lamar, the inventor of Wi-Fi,
the inventor of Wi-Fi. Oh, that
that,
pleases me.
which is much more fitting. So I like that as well. However, my favorite appearance and reference in this show, in episode 4, Temporal Mechanics 101, was the narrator of the holobook, Temporal Mechanics 101.
Yes,
So, do you know who that was?
I didn't. I enjoyed the entire Temporal Mechanics 101 sequence, though. I thought it was delightful.
It was, including the fact that they actually have a chapter on how to build a time ship. We don't recommend you do it, but if you need to, here's how. I was like,
Here's
don't
how.
give people this information, it's too dangerous. So that she introduced herself as Dr. Aaron McDonald, and I thought that sounded familiar. So I looked it up, and Dr. Aaron McDonald is a real life astrophysicist who, for the last 5 years, has been hired as a science consultant on Star Trek. She has
That's
her own
delightful.
YouTube series called Dr. Aaron Explains the Universe. She briefly
Amazing.
appeared in the Prodigy Season 1 finale, Supernova Part 2, and she was alluded to in an episode of Lower Decks where they were talking about time travel, and Shax, the head of security, says, Dr. Aaron says we can't do that. He was referring to Dr. Aaron McDonald. So you could argue that she is playing a fictionalized version of herself who is a Starfleet officer, but you could also argue she's playing herself, which if she is, to my knowledge, she is only the second person in history to play herself on Star Trek, the first being Dr. Stephen Hawking.
Ah, that's lovely.
So,
Oh, we're gonna go with that then. I really enjoyed the Temporal Mechanics 101 stuff. I liked the tone of it. I liked the presentation of it. It kind of put me a little bit in mind of the TVA and Loki, the Time Variance Authority. Um,
I haven't seen Loki.
Okay, well, so there's a lot of time travel in it, and a lot of like timeline management, and it's got this kind of like mid-century aesthetic, and I don't know, it just reminded me a little bit of like Miss Minutes and all of the sort of company manuals and things like that are in the Time Variance Authority and Loki. It just felt like a very much of a piece. So I enjoyed that a lot.
Loki is on my list. I have not seen any of the MCU shows. Well, I guess I watched WandaVision and Miss Marvel, but I haven't because I had to understand the movies. But I want to go back and watch some more eventually.
This podcast is not about that, but we can talk about that later.
That can be our spin-off when this season of Transporter Lock is done. But I'm really enjoying Prodigy so far, which is not a surprise. I still find Dal annoying, and he's so non-subtle and so obnoxious and brash and egotistical. And I hope that he eventually learns some humility, but maybe he doesn't need to because kids need to embrace who they are. But
You
regardless,
know,
I'm enjoying Prodigy.
I feel like Dal is pretty well written as like a teenage boy. Um, and that is something because I too find Dal a little bit annoying and frustrating. And um, some friends of mine had teenage sons, and the family was going through some stuff, and so they were doing some family therapy. And my friend, who was the stepmother in the situation, um, confided in me, of course, not without giving any details about what her kids were going through or anything. She did say to me, after a session, the therapist sat me and my husband down and said, I need you to understand that at this age, they're just crazy. Like if they were adults behaving this way, we would diagnose them and medicate them. But because this is where they are in their development, it's considered normal. But like it's not your imagination that they are irrational and frustrating and all of those things. That's just how kids this age are. And as I head into that phase of life with my own child, this is the kind of thing that I try to keep before me, is that they're supposed to be like that. They're supposed to be like that. That's part of the process for them. That's not like Dal is not a fully formed adult. And so he's supposed to be erratic and unable to keep a secret and self-centered and all of those things, because this is when kids learn how to human against their peers. And so, yes, I do find Dal kind of frustrating and annoying, but I am also reminded that this is very appropriate for Dal. And, assuming that Dal, whatever species he is, has adolescence the same way humans do, this is very appropriate. And so for me, as a parent, it is a reminder that my task is patience right now. Um, and patience and acceptance. So it's yes, it is frustrating and annoying, but it's also for me like it hits a little different.
Yeah, it's not only helpful for the kids to understand how to work through those emotions, it's also helpful for the adults to remind them that these emotions are coming or are here, and they're
Mhm.
not alone in seeing kids have these challenges.
And
Yeah.
it's something that I tell my son and have to remind myself a lot is, the very first step at becoming good at something is being really bad at it, right? And so like these kids, they don't ever learn to not be this way except by going through the process of being this way.
Mhm.
And that's part of it. That's what's normal. Of course, they don't have the emotional skills of a fully formed adult who's been through Starfleet Academy yet. He's not that. And he's still kind of figuring out his relationships and how he's figuring out who he wants to be. And that's part of his journey. And we don't usually see that in Trek, right? We see fully formed adults who have been through the academy and are expected to behave in a certain way. And this show is very much not about that. And so that's a little bit of a tonal shift for us.
Yeah, Prodigy is not like any other Star Trek out there, and I don't know if that's why Paramount Plus canceled it, but I'm glad that it found a home on Netflix.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
I'm really enjoying it.
And I'm enjoying chatting with you about it.
This is so much fun, Ken. I'm so glad we're doing this.
Me too, and I'm glad we're going to do it again soon. Until next time.
Go fast.
If you've enjoyed this episode, please leave a review on iTunes and keep your hailing frequencies open by following us on Twitter at TransporterLock or subscribing to our podcast and email newsletter at transporterlock.com.
Nerds.
Nerds.